Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Sascha Becker from Warwick University and the ESRC Center for Competitive Advantage in the Global Economy. It's been a pleasure to set up this event together with Angus. The first session will be entitled, What are UK free trade agreements likely to contain? So we will try to get very practical here. The most obvious element of any free trade agreement is trade. So the first speaker will talk about the trade dimension of free trade agreements, but obviously other aspects are also at play. Today we will highlight two further ones. One is migration, that will feature highly in the debate, and the other one is investment. As you all know, the EU was founded or started in 1957 with the Treaty of Rome. And already there, enshrined in the DNA of the EU, is the statement that free movement of workers, importantly workers, not people, shall be secured within the community by the end of a transitional period, however long that took in the end. So freedom of movement is a key element of the EU's setup. Observers of the Brexit referendum think that to a large degree, the vote leave side won because migration played a key role. Now, whether that's empirically the case is a matter of debate. I myself have done some work with colleagues at Warwick, Timo Fetzer and Dennis Novi, trying to understand the vote leave pattern across the UK. And at least empirically speaking, it doesn't seem as if migration from particularly Eastern Europe can explain the vote leave margin. But still, that doesn't mean that migration is completely irrelevant. So in other related work, we've looked at the rise of UKIP, and interestingly, the vote leave share is roughly speaking the UKIP vote share in the European Parliament elections of 2014 plus 25%. And so understanding the rise of UKIP in the European Parliament, because there we have proportional voting, whereas in the House of Commons, we may not see the true support for UKIP because of first past the post. Understanding the rise of UKIP can maybe help to understand also the Brexit result. Anyways, we find in that related work that migration from Eastern Europe does have an effect on the UKIP vote share. Areas that received more migrants from Eastern Europe were more likely to vote UKIP. But numerically speaking, again, the effect is relatively small and unlikely to explain the Brexit result. Anyways, it turns out, I just read on the newspaper yesterday, that migration will probably also feature high in the future. The manager of Pret a Manger, one of these outlets where you buy your coffee, claims that only 1 in 50 job applicants they have is British. So he is pointing to the fact that also in the future firms in the UK may want to have EU workers and other workers be able to work for them. Anyways, with the UK leaving the EU, not only migration will matter, but also investment. Foreign direct investment in the UK is also potentially at risk. And one of our speakers will highlight that dimension. So let me introduce the speakers. The first is Thomas Sampson. He is Assistant Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. He will highlight the trade dimension. Then Jonathan Portis is Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College, and he will highlight the migration dimension. And then to my right is Professor Nigel Triffield. He is Professor of International Business and a Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor at Warwick University, and he will cover the investment dimension. So without further ado, let's start out with Thomas Sampson.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to the organisers for putting together what I expect will be a very interesting day and for giving me the opportunity to speak. So, first off, kind of looking back to what we've learnt so far this year about what the scope and content of our upcoming negotiations with the EU and other partners may be. I mean, I think, as everyone in this room will know, we've learnt two big things definitively from Theresa May's speech earlier this year. One is that the UK is planning to leave the single market, and the other is that it is almost certainly also planning to leave the EU's customs union. So, I mean, that's going to be the background for a lot of what we talk about today. What is much less certain is what exactly the UK is looking for to replace its current arrangements with the EU. Broadly speaking, the government has made noises about trying to look for a kind of broad and deep FTA with the EU that will, to as great an extent as possible, replicate current levels of market integration in goods and services. But, to as great an extent as possible is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Inevitably, there are going to be a lot of trade-off the government faces in the negotiations. For example, one clear trade-off is a lot of the quantitative work on the effects of Brexit places great importance on what happens to non-tariff barriers between the UK and the EU. A key ingredient in keeping non-tariff barriers low is minimizing regulatory divergence between the UK and the EU. But realistically, what the UK would need to do after leaving the EU to keep regulatory barriers low is probably in most cases mimic EU regulation. Now, whether the government is going to be willing to do that, and whether that's a trade-off it thinks is worth making, we still have very little information about. Right? Likewise, there's been a lot of noise about seeking free trade agreements with non-EU trading partners, and the big prize there would be a deep free trade agreement with the US. But exactly how feasible that is and how far the government is willing to go in terms of making concessions to secure such an FTA, we don't know very much about. So to set the stage for, I think, the discussions we'll be having throughout the day, what I want to do in my talk is to introduce and present some research that's been done on the coverage of free trade agreements recently by a team at the World Bank. Just show you some of the key findings that come out of that research, and then use it to think about, what does this tell us about what the UK's objectives should be going forward? What are the key trade-offs we're likely to face, and what might we think should be the big picture priorities the government is going to want to have in its trade negotiations? Okay, so the work I'm going to be talking about has been done by this team at the World Bank under Hoffman, Osnager, and Rutter. And what they've done is they've recently released a big new database that they've put together looking at the coverage of all the preferential trade agreements currently in force in the world. Right? So just a brief note on terminology here. In their work, they refer to preferential trade agreements as a term that's kind of a catch-all that covers the full range of traditional free trade agreements, but then also deeper integration agreements such as customs union, the European Economic Area, and the EU itself. So it's that catch-all term that they're trying to use when they talk about preferential trade agreements. So what do we know about preferential trade agreements? There's 279 that are currently in force and notified to the WTO. And what they do in this data set is for each of these agreements, they code whether the agreement covers 52 different policy areas. So they're looking at, what is the scope of different agreements. Okay? So what do they mean by policy areas here? I mean, here are some examples. I'm not going to list them all, but one would be, does the free trade agreement cover reductions in agricultural tariffs, which obviously is a very controversial area in trade policy because a lot of the progress the WTO has made in reducing tariffs in manufacturing, hasn't really made in the agricultural area. And then there's things like, do they cover the services market access? Are technical barriers to trade included? What about intellectual property rights? And then also kind of some areas which are less obviously related to trade, but which have started to show up certainly in agreements like the EU, but also in a number of other trade agreements. So issues like, do they cover data protection laws? Are there requirements on taxation, either harmonization across countries or countries agreeing binding limits on what tax policies they might impose? And even are there kind of cooperation agreements to dealing with terrorism in these policy areas? So it's worth bearing in mind some of these policy areas are clearly core concerns of trade agreements. Others are more peripheral. The other important limitation of this data set to bear in mind is that it's really simply about the breadth of agreements and not the vertical depth, which is to say they code whether these areas are covered and they code whether there is legally enforceable language that covers these areas, But say within an area such as agricultural tariffs, they won't differentiate based on how deep the cuts in agricultural tariffs under the free trade agreement are. Right? So there's a lot more we could know about PTAs, but this is kind of the most comprehensive database that we now have available and which has just become available. So I wanted to highlight some of the findings that come out of this database. Right. So first off, what does this tell us about the preferential trade agreements that the EU is involved in and which we will be leaving following Brexit? So EU members have 36 preferential trade agreements currently in force, covering trade with 55 countries, plus obviously also the 27 EU member states. So that's a relatively large number of countries that are covered by EU preferential trade agreements. Though it's worth noting that if you look at the list of these 55 countries, there's a lot of small island economies in there. And obviously many of the bigger countries, the US, China, and India, don't currently have preferential trade agreements with the EU. If we look at the depth of the average EU preferential trade agreement, the average EU PTA covers about half of these policy areas that are in the database, around 25 policy areas. Comparing that to other regions, which we're doing on this chart here, the EU on average has deeper preferential trade agreements than any other region in the world. So the way to read this map is the darker the colour is, the more extensive are the preferential trade agreements negotiated by that region. And you can see the EU countries are the darkest coloured. Countries here, also the US has fairly deep preferential trade agreements, as does Australia, and some of the Latin American countries. Africa and Asia typically strike much more limited preferential trade agreements. Why does the EU have deeper preferential trade agreements? The action is mainly coming from the fact that the EU itself and the European Economic Area are by far the deepest preferential trade agreements in the data set. So we can see that in this graph here, where we're looking for different time periods, looking at trade agreements that were signed during different time periods. So we've got the first half of the 1990s on the left here, up to the more recent period on the right. This little box here is showing the interquartile range, so it's showing where most of the trade agreements lie, and then plotted up the top here, showing much deeper trade agreements. You can see these are mainly EU trade agreements. So, for example, if we look in the 1990s, the average trade agreement had just below 10 provisions in it. NAFTA covered just over 20, so NAFTA went much further than most trade agreements at that time. But then the EEA area, which was signed in 1994, covered about 36 of these areas. So it was much deeper. And the EU itself is currently coded in their database as covering 42 of the areas, which is the maximum observation in the data set. So kind of the first big picture thing that comes out of this data set is EU PTAs are relatively deep. The natural thing to then ask is, does the depth of a PTA, as measured in this data set, does it matter for trade? Right? Is it the case that as we sign deeper PTAs, they have bigger trade effects? So they look at that, okay? And in particular, this paper by Mulabdic, Osnaga, and Ruta estimates a gravity model type specification where they include a variable that looks at what is the depth of the preferential trade agreement, and also they include an interaction of the depth with, is one of the trade partners the UK? Right? So this table here is showing these results, both for total trade and then separated into trade in goods and trade in services. So two things to note. One is that the effect of depth on trade is consistently positive, relatively large, and highly statistically significant. So there is an association between deeper preferential trade agreements and more trade. The other interesting thing, particularly for thinking about the UK, that comes out of this, is they look at whether there are kind of UK-specific effects, whether depth matters more to the UK than it does to other countries. Right? I think this is a very interesting exercise because one of the criticisms, and one of the valid criticisms, that has been levied against some of the research that's been done trying to analyse the trade effects of Brexit, so for example, the research we did at LSE, is that it was based on average estimates of the effects of EU membership across all EU member states. So the estimates weren't specific to the UK. So what's nice here is they're looking at not just the average effects, but also the UK-specific effects. And what this is telling us is that for goods trade, there isn't a UK-specific effect. But for services trade, depth seems to matter significantly more for the UK than it does for the average other country in the sample. So perhaps this is not too surprising given how important services trade is for the UK, but it's showing that depth is really important to the UK in services. Using these estimates, the final exercise they then do is say, well, what if we change from our current relations with the EU to other examples of types of preferential trade agreement that are in the data set? How would that affect the UK's trade in goods and in services? So there are three scenarios they consider in this table. The single market scenario, the Norway scenario. Then what happens if we strike the kind of average type of free trade agreement with the EU? And what happens if there's no agreement? Right? And you can see that in all these scenarios, goods and services trade declines, but the drops are much bigger in the no agreement or the average FTA scenario than in the Norway scenario. Right? So this highlights the point that Angus made in his introduction, that sure, we're likely to have a free trade agreement with the EU, but it really matters what's in that free trade agreement. And there is wide scope for different effects depending on how deep the preferential trade agreement is. A couple of final things I want to say. Right, so far I've focused on trade with the EU. Right, an obvious question then is, well, if we leave the customs union, the advantage of that is that we can then strike deals outside the customs union. Can they make up for potential lost trade with the EU? So here's some simple calculations that illustrate to what extent that might be possible. For every 1% decline in UK-EU trade, trade with the US would have to increase by 3.7% to make up for the lost trade with the EU. So this gives you a sense of how much of a boost to trade with the US you would have to be if that's where you seek to make up for lost trade with the EU. If we take the average PTA scenario from the previous slide, what that means is trade with the US would have to grow by 152% to compensate for the loss in trade with the EU that paper is estimating. Right? My personal opinion is that the estimates in that paper are actually slightly higher than we would be likely to see in practice. Our preferred estimate in the work we did at LSE was that leaving the single market and striking a typical FTA would cut trade with the EU by a quarter, which is smaller than their estimate. But this gives a sense of how big the potential effects would have to be. Right? If we go beyond just an FTA with the US and also strike FTAs with our 7 other leading non-EU trade partners, and I think the chances of doing that are pretty low, but even if we did, trade with all those partners would have to increase by 73% to make up for the lost trade with the EU. So you need really big trade effects coming from outside the EU to make up for those losses. Why is that? Well, I mean, it's pretty simple. We trade mostly with the EU. So right, here's UK trade in 2014. Half is with the EU. Another 10% is with either EFTA countries or other big countries that the EU has signed a free trade agreement with. So about 60% of total UK trade is covered under EU preferential trade agreements, whereas our next biggest trade partner, the US, only accounts for 13% of trade, and then China 5%, and all these other countries are relatively small. And if you're starting from a small base, however deep a free trade agreement you sign, the absolute increase in trade is going to be relatively limited. So I am going to manage to keep to my time, which is good. Summing up kind of where I think, useful starting points for the discussion today, and I hope we'll get into a lot more detail during the day. One thing that comes out very clearly of this research and other work that's been done, Monique has done some work which has a very similar message, is that making up for lost trade with the EU by signing FTAs with third countries is a bit of a Herculean task and is unlikely to be possible, both because we trade so much with the EU and because the EU is such a deep trade agreement currently with such big trade effects that any other type of trade agreement that's possibly on the table with the US is not going to go as far as the EU goes. That's not even under consideration. So what should the UK's priorities be? And I've got a kind of couple of big picture suggestions here. One is that it's more important to maintain existing market access to the EU and to markets that have a PTA with the EU than it is to invest resources in seeking free trade agreements with non-EU partners. To the extent that there is a trade-off between doing those two things, the priority should be on working to maintain existing market access with the EU. And kind of a side point here is there's a political logic to leaving the single market in the sense that if you want to control migration and not be under the jurisdiction of the ECJ, you're kind of out of the single market. That same logic doesn't provide any reason for leaving the customs union. I think whether you stay in the customs union or not should be more of a simply what is economically best for the country. I don't see any clear political criterion for why we have to leave the customs union. Right? Now, we can have a debate about whether it's economically sensible to stay in the customs union or not. But despite the decisions that seem to have been made, no one has made a good case for why it is economically in the UK's interest to leave the customs union. Right? And certainly my prior would be that it's probably not going to be good for UK trade to leave the customs union. So I think this is an area where the political logic that is guiding the debate has kind of driven us into a decision which probably should be more of a narrow economic decision. And then kind of the final point, which is slightly unrelated to what I've been saying so far, but I think it's important to stress, is if we do want a deep preferential trade agreement with the EU that does as good a job as possible in maintaining existent market access, there's really no way that's being negotiated before the 2-year cutoff of Article 50 kicks in, which means some kind of transition agreement is going to be needed. And if I was trying to set the UK government's agenda for the negotiations, the first thing I would want to talk about in trade is ensuring that there will be some kind of transition agreement. Because the closer it gets to the deadline without reaching an agreement, and the more desperate a position the UK is in, the worse deal it's likely to end up getting. So from kind of a game theoretic position, I think it's kind of a no-brainer that the first priority should be looking for a transition arrangement. Okay, so I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. Our next speaker is Jonathan Portis. There is one seat over here for you if you want, in the first row.
Morning. So I'm going to talk about immigration policy after Brexit. I'm not going to say a lot, although I'm happy to mention and to ask questions about what precisely might be in future trade agreements outside the EU on immigration policy, because I think the short answer is that that in the short to medium term the UK has not thought at all about this subject, except to the extent of ruling some things out, and we already saw that, of course, in the Prime Minister's trip to India, when the Indians made clear that a precondition for any sort of serious negotiations about an India-UK trade agreement was the same as the Indians' preconditions for any sort of serious talk about an India-EU free trade agreement, which is that migration policy and at least the movement of highly skilled workers for the purpose of delivering services had to be a significant part of the agenda. And they also made clear that they were not terribly happy about the way that the UK treated Indians applying to study here. The Prime Minister essentially was not interested in talking about this, and the result is that India-UK trade relations, as some of us predicted before the referendum, are going nowhere quite slowly in the short to medium term. So I do not think this is going to be a major subject for the UK in the immediate future. It may at some point down the line. I'll say a few words about that later. But I'm going to start by talking more broadly about UK immigration policy, how it might evolve, and how that will tie into our future relationship with the EU. So, first of all, what's the current system? We have very much a two-tier system. We have free movement for EEA citizens. They have the right not just to move for work, but to seek work, to be self-employed, or if they're self-supporting. There are some limited restrictions in theory and some even more limited restrictions, which is to say virtually no restrictions at all in practice for people from other EE member states coming here. By contrast, for people coming here for work purposes from outside the EEA, there are some pretty tightly regulated restrictions. The main route is something called the Tier 2 route. For skilled workers, there is a quota and there are salary and qualification restrictions. There is also a small list of shortage occupations. Separately, but also within Tier 2, there are inter-company transfers, for which there are no quota and which are a lot easier to get, but for which there is a very high salary threshold. There are also provisions for people coming from outside the EU under other routes. So what then are the options for the new system? And I think there are three, at least before the referendum, there were sort of three possible options for a post-Brexit immigration system that were on the table. Let me go through each of them. So this was the vote leave proposal. No discrimination was the key element. That is to say, people from anywhere outside the UK would be treated the same wherever they came from. And the system would be points-based. It would be based on skills or some measures of human capital. Now, the Prime Minister very quickly, after the election, ruled that out. She said she didn't like the Australian system. She didn't think that this human capital-based approach, she didn't quite use those words, but she essentially said that was not the right way for an immigration system for a country like the UK to go, and she essentially ruled that out. The second type of system you might look at is something that I would describe as modified free movement. That is, that attempted to preserve the very current degree of labour mobility that exists between the UK and the rest of Europe, but while putting various restrictions on it that made it much more clearly that it was about free movement of workers, not about persons, and that attempt to address what some people thought were the main issues that at least some of the electorate were worried about, that is, people coming without a job, benefit tourism and the like. So what would this look like? Well, there are various elements that you could imagine being part of this, these type of arrangements. First of all, you could have something that's like the current EEA arrangements that apply, for example, to Norway, where there is an emergency break, that is an overall limit on work-related migration that can be invoked in particular circumstances. The Norwegians have not in practice ever tried to invoke this, but it's at least a theoretical possibility. It was one of the things that the Prime Minister was at one point in his renegotiation looking for. Second set of things, restrictions on labour market access. For example, you might need a job offer in order to exercise free movement, or there might be national preference for UK citizens as opposed to EA citizens in some circumstances. Now, this is what the Swiss are introducing in response to the referendum decision in Switzerland to introduce a quota for EEA nationals. The EU told the Swiss in no uncertain terms that was not on, and if they tried to do that, they were going to be kicked out of the single market. The Swiss, in response to this, have essentially backed down, but they have, after tortuous negotiations with the EU, agreed that they may be allowed, in some particular and pretty limited circumstances, be allowed to exercise national preference. This is a bit of a fig leaf, I think, frankly. But you can imagine these sorts of restrictions applying if the UK was outside the EU. And finally, restrictions on access to benefits to public services. Of course, the Prime Minister did get some of this in his renegotiation, but you can imagine going a bit farther. Now, all of these, I think, were we looking to negotiate a very deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, and what I think you'll be thinking about here is what you might call EEA minus. In other words, I don't think we could call it the EEA for various political reasons, but if you said we were essentially trying to negotiate a UK-specific version of the EEA, which involves a considerable degree of single market access across the board, probably some sort of treaty-based arrangement, as the EA has, and some sort of treaty-based dispute resolution settlement. And this, of course, relates to quite a bit of the sort of thing that Tom was talking about and that Angus mentioned and has mentioned before. Then you can imagine that this sort of modified free movement, somewhere not at the level of Norway or Switzerland, but a step behind, but still essentially free movement, might be very well be part of those negotiations. I think it is pretty clear that that is not the current UK direction of travel. Ruling out, the Prime Minister said very clearly that we are going to have control of our own immigration policy. We are going to make policy, and that we're not going to be subject to the European Court of Justice or European judges. Now, neither of those two things formally and completely rules out the sort of arrangement that is described here. But I think it certainly, if not in letter, in spirit, would violate what I think the Prime Minister is trying to achieve and what she's promised to the British people. So at the moment, I think this is not what's on the agenda. But of course, it is the sort of thing that you can imagine coming back on the agenda over the next 2 years if politics takes a particular turn. And as we've seen, I think, in the last 2 years, one should be very reluctant to make two forecasts that are too definitive about scenarios in this respect. So I don't think this is where we're headed, but it doesn't mean we won't be where we end up. And finally, and this is where we are headed at the moment, you can imagine some modification of the current work permit scheme. So this is a brief description of the current system, which is very complicated for people from outside the EU. As I said, thresholds, some shortage occupations, an overall quota for skilled workers, intra-company transfers without a quota. The basic point here is that the system is expensive, it's bureaucratic, it is manageable if you're a large company, it's not really manageable if you're a small company. So then, if we were to move to try and extend this current system to post-Brexit Britain, what would it look like? So what are the key outstanding issues? And these, I think, are the main ones for me. First of all, are we going to try and modify the existing system, or are we going to go to a quite different system in terms of what the processes and procedures actually look like? The advantage of the former is that, well, the current system may not work perfectly, but it is there. The Home Office does know how to work it. Large companies at least know how to work it. The disadvantage, as I said, it's expensive, it's bureaucratic, it really only works for large companies, and it may or may not be capable of being scaled up to the sort of volumes which would be required. Second set of issues, not yet, I think, even remotely near to being decided what the level and scope of any overall quotas would be. The third, and this is the key one and the one that ties into the negotiations, is will there be European preference in this new system? In other words, are we going to have a non-discriminatory system, or are we going to have a system where there is some preference still for either EU or EEA nationals vis-a-vis non-EU or non-EU nationals? And this seems to me, this is a very important question. It's very much up in the air. And what's not clear at all is whether this will in fact be part of the negotiations. It is quite unclear, I think, at the moment whether immigration policy is something that we want to be negotiating about at all, and it's not clear to me whether it's something that other EU countries want to be negotiating about at all either. The Prime Minister said she wants us to have control over our own system. That sort of implies that whatever there will be in any trade new agreement is not going to have much, if anything, about migration. Equally, from the point of view of EU member states, they've made their position quite clear. Either you're in the single market, which includes free movement, or you're out. If you're not interested in free movement, you're out. The logical consequence of that is that whatever we're going to be talking about is not the single market, and it doesn't include free movement, and there's no particular reason to have any detailed discussions about migration. There is a view among some people, it appears to me to be a view among some politicians or something, that there's something we can offer here. We can offer European preference, and in return, the Europeans will be inclined to give us something more on other aspects of trade deals. It's far from clear to me that is why that should be the case. It is not clear to me why if we go to the governments of Poland and Latvia and say, well, we're talking about this new trade deal. Here's a really big concession we're prepared to make. We are still prepared to take your doctors, your skilled engineers, and your university professors. We just don't want your builders and your cleaning ladies. It is not clear to me that that buys us anything, quite frankly. So if I had to bet at this point, my bet is that, that this will not be a major topic in the negotiations. But that remains to be seen. And as we say, a lot can happen in 18 months. Finally, again, very much up in the air, sector-based schemes. The current work permit scheme is not a sector-based scheme. There are shortage occupations, but there are occupations, not sectors, and they cover only a very small proportion of overall skilled migration. But there has been a lot of talk about sector-based schemes for agriculture, implicitly for finance, perhaps for other sectors like food manufacturing, hospitality, who knows. Every sector, of course, probably, if you ask them, will say, we need a scheme. The government has not made its position clear, quite rightly so, and I think there are some big pros and cons. On the pro side, you know, sector-based schemes does let you respond to this sectoral lobbying and lets you address the needs of individual sectors. And in principle, if you have an industrial strategy, which we're going to be talking about later, it could somehow support this industrial strategy. It might also, in some ways, be less bureaucratic. There are some big cons, in my views. In my view, it essentially, the sectoral lobbying, of course, is a con as well as a pro. And in particular, to do it properly, it requires a degree of central planning of the UK labour market and Whitehall capacity to do that central planning, which, frankly, I do not believe, and I don't think any of my former colleagues in Whitehall believe, Whitehall really is capable of doing. There are huge administrative issues. We used to have a sector-based scheme for agriculture. It worked quite well. But basically, what happened there was gangmasters brought over people, accommodated them in fields in Lincolnshire and hired them out to farmers. That is not going to work in the financial sector. It's not going to work for pret-a-manger either. The administrative issues here, I think, are quite challenging. Finally, how long have I got? Not very long.
1 minute.
1 minute. Two really important points I always make. First of all, ending free movement is not about border control. We will not be controlling Europeans coming for work purposes at the borders any more than we control Americans or Australians coming for work purposes at the borders in any meaningful sense. Control will be, as it is now for Americans, at the workplace. That is the big difference. So when we say we're ending free movement, we're not going to be ending free movement. What we are is going to be putting on employers a huge degree of extra responsibility to ensure that the Europeans working for them are not only here legally, but have the legal right to work. That is going to be a very significant increase in bureaucracy and enforcement. This really, really, really matters to business, especially small business. And it cannot be said often enough, this is not really about, and what happens at the borders is very important, but free movement of workers is not really about the borders. I'm not going to skip that. Finally, something that's been a lot in the news, but I talked about 6 months ago why this was going to be a mess. Transitional issues for resident EU citizens. The basic point is here, there are 3 million people here. We've made a political commitment, and I'm sure that will in some way be fulfilled to let them stay. We don't know who they are. There is no population register. There's no database of entries and exits. The 3 million estimate comes from survey evidence. We are going to have to come up with we know the current system for giving permanent residence is not remotely fit for purpose for dealing with this. We need a new system. We need to start thinking about how that new system is going to work now. But whatever we do, there's going to be this long period of uncertainty, which is going to be hard for individuals and bad for business. The conclusion, what do I think is going to happen, and this is rather downbeat, we are going to increase regulation and the size of the state. We are going to reduce flows of both skilled and unskilled workers. How much damage we do, though, how big those impacts will depend on how open or closed the new system is and how it is administered. And we're a very long way from learning what that's going to look like. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Johnson. Nigel?
Okay. I come at this from kind of two perspectives, really. On the one hand, a long time ago, I did a PhD in economics. So when confronted with a question, my instincts are get some data and run some regressions. At the same time, I basically earn my money by talking to business. Okay, either in terms of executive education, MBAs, whatever it may be. I spend an awful lot of time talking to business, trying to help them figure this out, and also working with inward investment agencies, LEPs, such bodies, the Combined Authority of the West Midlands, as is coming, trying to help them figure out what on earth is going to happen and what on earth we are going to do about this. So I kind of come at this from two perspectives. So I'm kind of going to give you an overview and get to a conclusion that probably we're all not going to like. Oh, my thingy's not working. Oh. Let's try that. Marvellous. Okay. The red line, this is the one that I use when I talk to business people and clients of law firms and stuff, because it gets their attention straight away. The red line, that's our trade deficit. The blue line is inward investment flows into the UK. Okay, so just imagine for a minute the red line more or less stays where it is and the blue line halves, and then imagine what the pound is worth. Okay, that kind of captures people's attention. Okay, now within that inward investment flows, that includes Russian billionaires buying Mayfair. It includes the £10 that a Chinese firm paid to buy Marconi. It doesn't include Hicks and Gillette buying Liverpool because they just borrowed the money from a UK bank. They just happen to be foreign. But basically, so it's not quite the same as foreign manufacturing, but it's the sort of stuff that offsets our huge trade deficit. Okay, so a little bit of sort of strategy 101. Why firms come here at all? With apologies for stating the obvious. Well, foreign investors come here either because they're looking for new customers, new technology, efficiency savings, or not really in the case of the UK, new resources. Okay, that is basically why, you know, International Business 101, that is why firms do foreign investment, for one of those reasons. Now, the EU has been great for this because what the EU does, if we take a sort of, I confess now, I don't think in terms of sectors, I don't think in terms of firms, I think in terms of value chains. Okay? At one end, we've got, I'm not going to try, if I try and light it up, it'll probably go wrong. Oh, let's not bother. At my left, there is product innovation, R&D, people in white coats doing stuff. The sort of stuff that Andrew Whitty says he wants £1 billion a year to keep in the UK. He's the chief exec of Glaxo, if you're wondering who he is. I've worked with him on a few things. When he says £1 billion, he's not kidding. He doesn't mean 15 quid, he means £1 billion. Okay? And then you've got the stuff that kind of comes in and goes out. Some of it goes out to China, some of it goes out to Poland, some of it goes to South Wales. The sort of less value-added stuff in the middle. That doesn't really matter whether you're talking about building the iPhone or providing financial services. You know, there are American law firms that now employ more people in the Philippines than they do in America in many cases, because the middle bit is cheaper to have it somewhere like that. And then you have the connecting to customers, the marketing stuff, the sort of people in, you know, sort of loud shirts and ties doing the selling, coming up with connecting to customers. Now, the EU has been absolutely brilliant for allowing firms both in Europe and wanting to invest in Europe to coordinate that. Okay? It is almost impossible to understate just how important that has been. The free movement of, to be blunt, bloody everything. You know, and you can look these up for yourself. The FT did a piece a while ago where certain components of a truck went in and out of the UK something like 9 times. You know, there are loads of examples like this. Okay? And it's just been brilliant for allowing that to be organised. Yes, some of it goes to China and some comes back. Some goes to Poland, some, you know, in the middle. But basically, the EU has just been great for business organising that. And we've basically voted to cut ourselves off from it. Okay, just again, another example. This is too small, apologies. But basically what this is this is the proportion of exports that are imported first. Okay, by country. So, fairly obviously, far left, you've got Luxembourg. Small, probably the most open economy in the world. Basically everything that goes out came in at some point. And then you've got here, not surprisingly, New Zealand. Probably, I would say, I'm not a geographer, but geographically the most isolated developed economy in the world in terms of where it is, I would have thought. So it's not surprising that New Zealand has the lowest. New Zealand is 40. Okay, so even the most isolated economy in the world, 40% of its exports are imports first. Okay, and we're kind of here. Okay, so yeah, we're well over to the right, and you know, and I've seen people say, oh, you know, we are, you know, I saw Vote Leave produce a league table and said, oh, you know, we're hardly integrated at all. No, only just under half of what we export comes in first. Okay, now a huge proportion of that is what trade economists called intra-firm trade. You know, the largest importer of car components in Europe is Ford. Okay, and it comes in and goes out and whatever. Okay, so why does all of this matter so much? Well, coordination costs, risk, access to finance and currency. They are basically the things that drive firms' investment decisions. How easily can I coordinate stuff? What risks am I bearing? What access to finance restrictions do I face? Can I raise money locally? Do I need to bring it with me? And what's going to happen to currency? Okay, you want to know more on that, we can talk later. Basically, one of the things that we did, the sort of regression bit that we did, was we've got 50 years worth of, I'm tempted to say it's quarterly, but I'd have to check, 50 years of data on that foreign investment series that I showed you before. And just basically sort of, I don't do this, but I work with people who are much better time series econometricians than I am. And basically what we kind of did was decomposed all the noise into two processes. The sort of short-term volatility that's just noise, and then the long-term trend. Now we actually started doing this as nothing to do with Brexit whatsoever. The reason we started doing this was we wanted to know whether 50 years, I do regional policy, and I wanted to know whether 50 years of different regional policy had made a difference. And then somebody announced there was going to be a referendum, so we kind of, all right, let's do that as well then. And so basically what we do is, there are only, if you strip out all the noise, there are two things, and this is not something necessarily that I can econometrically prove, but you can just see it by looking at the data. There are two things that positively affected the long run trend. That was 1992 and entry into the EEC. They were the two things that have actually pushed up the long run trend in terms of foreign investment into the UK. What adversely affected it, you can see we go back a long way. For those of you who weren't around in the UK when Harold Wilson devalued the pound, apologies if you're younger than my dad, really. But what adversely affected it? Exit from the ERM. Why did that matter? Well, because it kind of gave a signal to the world that the Chancellor didn't know what he was doing. But exit from that, yeah, no problems. The pound in your pocket, Harold Wilson's devaluation to, I want to say 240 to 220, but I'm not quite old enough to remember, but there was a... Thank you very much. I couldn't see who said that, but thank you very much. You know, so basically currency things, okay? Two things that made the process more stable. When we started doing regional policy, we had EU Objective 1, Objective 2. That gave foreign investors somebody to talk to. They could talk to people at a regional level who had sitting behind them EU regional policy, which was about equality of opportunity. Okay, and then from 1999 onwards, we've had sort of coordinated inward investment policy, creation of UKTI, now part of the Department for Trade. But they kind of just made it, they didn't make it higher or lower, but they made the process more stable. Okay, what do I think is going to happen when we leave? Well, actually, something like that. Okay, we will move from one long-run trend to a lower one, but then even against that, we'll have a dip below the long-run trend, the new long-run trend, and take about 4 years to recover. Okay, that's kind of what we think is going to happen. Okay, I was asked to say, what can we do about it? Well, focus inward investment efforts on sectors where free trade within the EU is less important. Okay, at a regional level, for example, Jaguar Land Rover are saying they are going to try and have a far greater percentage of their supply chain based in the UK. They're talking about 100. I don't know who's going to grow the walnut trees, but basically that's kind of where firms are going. Nissan are making similar noises. Might talk about this in questions, but you know, Nissan's deal is probably not so much about Nissan. It's about Nissan's supply chain and support for that, and how the supply chain can support Nissan's process, but we can get back to that. Developing an inward investment strategy through greater understanding of why firms want to come here. Okay, we have been a bridge between the EU and the rest of the world for foreign investment. It's why we have so much Japanese, it's why we have so much American investment. We are seen as being a bridge into the EU. If we are going to vote to leave that, we need a plan. And we kind of need it yesterday. Okay, and then finally, in order to understand how these policy levers need to be applied, this is a bit similar to the point on immigration before, we need to understand all of this here. We need to have people whose job it is within base or wherever it is, who actually think about firms, about supply chains and how they can support all this. And much like there's not really any capacity to do all of this in a detailed way for immigration, there isn't any more of this. There isn't this capacity within sectors, supply chains, whatever else either. Then we can get on to overlay all of that with the conversations we've just had about what sort of exit we'll have, whether we're in a single market, whether we're in a customs union, so on and so on. Or alternatively, we could just not leave.
Okay, thanks to all of our speakers.